In controlled deception studies conducted in the late 20th century, participants with higher analytical reasoning scores did not consistently outperform average participants in detecting false statements when the misinformation was presented in logically structured form. Instead, their acceptance rates increased when the narrative exhibited high internal coherence, even when factual accuracy was deliberately manipulated. The pattern appeared most clearly when the deceptive information was internally consistent, logically structured, and free of obvious contradiction. The more clean the argument, the more likely it was to be accepted. This was not a failure of intelligence in the traditional sense. It was a failure of evaluation strategy. The question becomes unavoidable. Why does a more capable reasoning system sometimes increase vulnerability to persuasion rather than reduce it? This analysis centers on a cognitive distortion often discussed indirectly in the work of Daniel Kahneman, the substitution of coherence for truth. When the brain encounters structured information, it does not immediately evaluate accuracy. It first evaluates processing fluency, how easily the information can be internally modeled. In parallel, Robert Cialdini's research on influence shows that perceived authority and consistency dramatically increase acceptance rates, even when evidence quality remains unchanged. The mechanism at work is not ignorance. It is over-reliance on internal pattern completion systems. By the end of this breakdown, you will recognize how analytical intelligence, when paired with certain assumptions about structure and logic, can become a liability in environments designed around controlled narratives, selective framing, and strategic omission. Not because intelligence fails, but because it trusts its own outputs too efficiently. Across deception studies, one consistent finding emerges. Participants are more likely to accept statements that are easier to mentally simulate. A coherent narrative, even when partially false, creates a smooth cognitive experience. That smoothness is interpreted as correctness. The brain does not directly sense truth, it senses effort, and it often treats low effort as high validity. This is where substitution begins. Instead of asking, "Is this true?" the mind unconsciously asks, "Does this feel complete?" Detection tool. When evaluating claims, pause at the moment of immediate agreement. If understanding arrives too quickly, treat it as a signal, not confirmation. A conclusion that forms without resistance may not be insight. It may be fluency bias in disguise. This creates the foundation for a more specific vulnerability, structured deception. In applied social psychology, fabricated explanations that include causal sequencing, because A led to B, which resulted in C, are significantly more persuasive than fragmented truths. Even when individual components are weak, the structure itself increases perceived reliability. This is particularly relevant in high IQ populations who are more sensitive to logical ordering than emotional framing. Intelligence does not only evaluate content, it evaluates architecture. And well-built falsehoods can pass as truth if the structure resembles genuine reasoning. Detection tool. Break the narrative mentally. Remove the causal connectors. If the argument collapses when stripped of sequencing language, it was supported by structure, not evidence. At this stage, deception is no longer about lying. It is about formatting, and formatting is harder to detect than falsehood. This leads into the next layer, confidence in internal simulation. Highly analytical individuals often construct internal models of situations faster than external data can contradict them. This creates a phenomenon where the mind completes a scenario before all variables are known. Behaviorally, this is observed as premature certainty, decisions made before full information exposure is complete. The faster a mind simulates reality, the less time it spends validating whether the simulation corresponds to actual conditions. Detection tool. Watch for the moment when you mentally finish someone else's argument before they complete it. That completion is not insight, it is closure bias. Closure feels like understanding, but it often ends inquiry prematurely. This is where intelligence becomes double-edged. It reduces ambiguity tolerance, and reduced ambiguity tolerance is precisely what strategic deception exploits. In Milgram-style obedience studies, authority does not always require explicit status markers. It can be constructed through confidence of delivery, structured reasoning, and controlled emotional tone. Participants comply not because authority is declared, but because it is performed consistently. This is where cognitive bias intersects with social perception. The brain treats consistency as legitimacy. When information is delivered without hesitation, the mind often upgrades its perceived credibility automatically, even in the absence of verification. Detection tool: separate delivery style from content validity. Ask, would this argument survive if spoken less fluently or less confidently? If the answer changes, perception, not evidence, is driving judgment. At this point, the vulnerability is no longer informational, it is perceptual. And perception is harder to override than logic. But here is where it becomes more complex. Studies on cognitive reflection show that individuals who perform well on reasoning tests are not uniformly susceptible to bias. In fact, they are often better at detecting flawed logic in isolation. However, when biases are embedded within highly structured, multi-step reasoning, detection accuracy decreases. The paradox is clear. The same analytical skill that improves truth detection in simple cases can reduce detection accuracy in complex ones, because the mind begins to trust its own ability to debug the argument after acceptance. It assumes correction is always possible later, but in real-time decision environments, later never arrives. A defining trait among analytically strong individuals is confidence in self-correction. The belief that errors will be detected and adjusted retroactively. This creates psychological permission to accept incomplete information temporarily, but in structured persuasion environments, that temporary acceptance becomes permanent before correction occurs. The illusion of future correction reduces present scrutiny, and reduced scrutiny is where influence stabilizes. Detection tool: ask a simple constraint question. What would need to be false for this conclusion to collapse? If no immediate answer appears, the system has not evaluated the claim, it has stored it, and stored beliefs are harder to question than newly formed ones. This leads into the accumulation phase of bias. If intelligence increases pattern completion speed and pattern completion increases premature closure, then intelligence is not simply a shield against deception. It is also a mechanism that can accelerate acceptance of coherent falsehoods under certain conditions, not because reasoning is flawed, but because reasoning assumes structure is correlated with truth, and that assumption is not always violated by obvious lies, it is exploited by well-constructed ones, which leads to an uncomfortable observation. The same mental architecture that helps you understand complex systems also makes you more comfortable inside systems that are convincingly structured, even when they are incomplete or selectively constructed. Not everyone is equally affected, but no one is exempt from the mechanism itself. Now that the mechanism is visible, application becomes precise. First tool: delay acceptance, not comprehension. Understanding can be immediate. Acceptance should not be. Insert temporal distance between coherence and belief. Second tool: dismantle structure before evaluating content. Reduce arguments to isolated claims. If truth disappears when structure is removed, structure was doing the persuasive work. Third tool: identify premature closure. Any moment where an explanation feels complete within seconds is a bias checkpoint, not a conclusion. The goal is not to think less efficiently. It is to prevent efficiency from replacing verification. Because once coherence is mistaken for truth consistently, the mind stops distinguishing between what fits and what is real, and that shift is rarely noticed by the person experiencing it. A final reframing: intelligence does not protect against deception by default. It protects only when it remains willing to interrupt its own certainty. The next layer in this series examines how social environments systematically reward this exact form of premature certainty, and how groups begin to amplify it collectively.